very happy to be hanging out with all of you this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name is Kevin Winnery, and I work for a company called Twilio. Yeah, once again, sorry, it's a little annoying, but you will have to mute yourselves when you come in, or else we'll get the feedback through the audio. So my name is Kevin Winnery. I work on a project called TwilioQuest. TwilioQuest is an educational video game for the PC, which we'll talk a little bit about. What I was hoping we could do in this session is talk about some of the learnings that I've had coming from a career in web development, spending most of my time building websites, web apps, that sort of thing, and then actually transitioning relatively recently into becoming a game developer and building out TwilioQuest. So we'll talk about some of the design tools that I've found to be useful. We'll also talk about some of the technical tools that I've found to be useful. And then we'll also have time to ask and answer any questions that you might have about game development, web development, or anything in between. So before we do any of those things, though, I want to take you back way, way, way back in ancient history to the 1990s and to the pinnacle of PC game development, which of course I'm referring to TIE Fighter, which was a space combat simulator set in the Star Wars universe that was released by LucasArts back in those days. And this is actually the reason why I am a software developer today. Back in those days, in order to play a PC game, it wasn't just, you download it from Steam and press play and everything is great. After you went to Circuit City and got the shrink wrapped box of a PC game, then you had to figure out how to make it actually work on your computer. So when I acquired TIE Fighter, very excited to play it. But the first day that I got it back, I realized that I could not play it. Number one, I had no CD-ROM drive. And it's not like these days where the lack of a CD-ROM drive on a computer is intentional. It was just a feature that my PC of those days was lacking. So step one, went back to the store, got a CD-ROM drive, had to figure out how to install it in the PC tower. Then I realized I'm gonna need at least 8 megabytes of RAM, not the 2 megabytes of RAM that my PC had at the time in order to play the game. So I had to kind of figure out how to upgrade the RAM on the computer in order to be able to play the game at all. So kind of one thing led to another, and I realized I kind of like working with computers. And I sort of resolved in those days that I was going to be a game developer. But like most of my childhood dreams from those days, like being an NFL quarterback, it didn't really materialize right away, at least not until I started working at this company called Twilio, where I was a developer evangelist, like John Gottfried, who you probably know already, or will meet later, one of the co-founders of MLH. And we had this conference at Twilio called TwilioCon. And on the first day of the conference, we wanted to create a training day where people could learn about the Twilio API and how everything worked. And I was put in charge of the training day because I had done some developer training stuff in the past. And I was generally dissatisfied with how I had done this before. It was usually PowerPoint presentation, then some hands-on activities, then more PowerPoint, then more presentations. And it usually was the case that it was always too slow for some people. They wished I would go faster and get to more advanced things. But then it was also too fast for other people. They were like, slow down, I'm new to this, I don't know what you're talking about. And it just never seemed to work for anybody. So being the huge dork that I am, I kind of latched on to the metaphor of role-playing games where you kind of level up at a different pace. And I figured if at a developer training event, if someone were to make their way through a couple of code exercises and that's all they could do, that's great. But if somebody was more advanced and they could go through 20 code exercises, that's great too. I wanted to support that type of experience as well. So I built the very first crappy version of TwilioQuest, which was essentially video game themed tutorials that you could do in the browser. And that was kind of the beginning of what is today something very different. So the early success of TwilioQuest kind of made us see the value of game design and gameplay in teaching technical concepts. And now we decided, like, okay, we've seen this kind of play out and be a valuable thing that developers seem to really enjoy. Let's push in our chips and really make TwilioQuest a video game. Let's try to make the Oregon Trail or the Number Munchers of learning how to code, which is something I was very excited to do. And we're on our way. I don't think we are there yet by any estimation. We have lots left to do. But we have a PC game that is designed to teach developers how to use the actual tools of software development. But when I sort of embarked on this process years ago, there was a major problem, which was that I had no idea what I was doing. I was a web developer by trade and training. And while I had put in a lot of study of video games by playing them a lot over the years, I actually didn't know very much about how to make one, given the skills that I had at the time. So I started doing some research on game design, found some books that were really useful. And I also got the opportunity before the fall of human civilization in March of this year, a few years back, to go to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. And while I was there, I learned about a really, what I thought was a really useful and sort of, easy to grok tool or sort of framework to think about how a game works from a design perspective. And I'm not sure what the academic origin of it is. I saw it in a panel discussion where they were talking about it, but even after a little bit of Googling, I'm not sure exactly where it came from. But there's this concept of the game design stack, and that these are sort of 5 properties which, when you explore them, kind of describe the DNA of your game. These are the things that kind of come together to make your game what it is. And if you consider these elements intentionally, then you can use that to focus your efforts on things that are actually going to make a difference in one of these 5 areas, and also to make hard decisions. If your game is more about one of these things than the other, you can afford to maybe spend less time thinking about one of these things and more time thinking about the others. So what are these things actually? And the words might seem somewhat self-explanatory, but they're worth thinking about at least a little bit when you're trying to evaluate how you design a game. And sort of at the base of the stack is a concept called fantasy in this framework. And that is essentially who or what the player will imagine themselves to be while they're playing the game. And this tool is a tool that's actually pretty unique to video game development versus other forms of media, where you can actually use one of the most powerful human instincts that there is, which is empathy. You could actually put the player in the shoes of another person so that they can experience a world, experience a story, experience whatever your game has to offer from the viewpoint of someone else, and use like the programming that we all have as humans of empathy to feel what it's like to live in that place, to be that person. And one example of this from recent memory that I think is really powerful is Spider-Man from PS4, on PS4. And if you haven't checked it out yet, definitely recommend that you do. But at the game developer conference that I was at years ago, the Spider-Man was kind of the belle of the ball. It was one of the games that everyone was talking about because of the traversal in the game. It was so much fun to like zip around on your webs and swing around New York City. But the reason why that mechanic is powerful is because it contributed so much to making you feel like you were Spider-Man. And that was one of many different mechanics in the game that all made you feel like, yep, I am Spider-Man right now. I'm swinging around New York and my aunt is calling me on the phone, bugging me about like being late for dinner, or I'm talking to my boss or something along those lines. All of those individual elements in the game come together to feed this fantasy of being someone else, so that you're not just hearing about Spider-Man, you're experiencing what it's like to actually be that character. So you trying to find ways to hook into empathy and put a player in another place where they don't usually find themselves is a powerful design element to consider. The other design element on the stack is action, and that describes what the player is actually going to do during the game. And there's lots of other games that are very strongly rooted in this. So like Madden, NFL football on all the major game consoles, This game is very much about the action. There isn't much of a story to speak of. There's not really an economy. Uh, there is a degree of fantasy if you've ever thought about being a professional football player, say, but it's really about the action, or any multiplayer game like League of Legends or Hearthstone, where the actual action of the game is indeed the experience of the game. So if your game is rooted in action, that might indicate that you need to think less about some of these other bits. So action is sort of the thing that you need to do in order to live the fantasy of your game environment. Economy is how the resources are created and exchanged within the context of your game. So most of the time, games require some kind of reward to compel players to go forward. So you beat a level and you get something in return. Maybe you get skill points to level up your character, or you get money that you can spend on things, that sort of things. And then there's games that are almost entirely centered in the economy. So like a farming simulator game is basically an economic simulator where you're growing vegetables and selling them for different prices and that sort of thing. So the economy helps establish like stakes and meaning to the actions that players take within the game. And then the world of the game is the sort of context in which the action happens, where the economy makes sense. So it's the space, history, culture, and constraints of the environment that the player inhabits. And one of the best examples of this in recent memory, for my money, is the latest Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, where you are the story is actually pretty rote, pretty weak, I would say. There's not much of it there to speak of. And some of these other elements are a little simple when compared to other games, but the world itself is so cohesive, right? There's the climbing and traversal aspects that allow you to kind of go anywhere and do anything you want at any given time. And much of the flavor of the game is exposed through organically discovering things in the environment as you play the game. So this is one example of a world really doing most of the heavy lifting for the experience of the game. And then finally, the story, which is the narrative that the player experiences or controls. And this ends up being pretty important in a lot of games. Some games are fully driven by story, like we have a shot from Transistor here, which is one of my favorite games from Supergiant, who the creators of Bastion, Hades, Pyre, and those classics. But the story can actually end up being pretty important, even in games where the story is sort of superficial. So even in a Mario game, which is really much about the action, you still have to have a story there. You have to have a reason for why you're doing the things that you're doing. You're jumping on top of turtles because you need to save someone who's been kidnapped by a even larger turtle. And while the story isn't super important, it provides a beginning, a middle, and an end for the structure of the content that you're creating in the game. So these 5 elements are kind of the lens, or some of the sort of lenses or ways that you can have insight into how your game actually works. And if you understand kind of where your game is anchored, what is most important to the kind of experience that you're trying to create, that allows you to make harder decisions about where to invest your time. So if your game is very much about action and you feel like that is the most important part of the game, some of these other things might be a little bit less important and might not be worth as much investment from you, especially if you're working by yourself or in a small team. And we described it before as a stack, and I actually went through the items in reverse order when we talked about how they all came together. And so why do we think about it as a stack? Largely it's because each of these elements kind of builds on one another. And you can't sort of create one without at least having some kind of foundation underneath it in these other areas. It's also in a stack in this order, not because of like order of importance. It's because some of these things are very easy to change, and some of these things end up being very hard to change. So if you start at the game development process with a fantasy of like, the player is a shark and you're going to go around doing shark things. You're going to eat fish, you're going to swim around, and that's going to dictate a lot of the different actions you're going to take in the game. And then maybe, when you eat a fish, your hunger goes down, like in Minecraft or something like that. And that is sort of the economic element of the game. And then the world is an ocean and you're going to do all of these different things. But if you wanted to say, change the fantasy of the game to like, you are going to be a chef, well, that kind of ruins everything else that you did further up the stack. So each of these things, as you change them, have bigger ramifications on the scope of the game's design and development than they do at a higher level. At the panel conference where I learned about this concept at GDC, one of my favorite examples was, back in the day, there was a game development studio that was making a game for a hardware platform that I don't even remember. I think it's since passed from memory. And the creators, the designers of the game said like, all right, it's a space, it's like a shooter game where it's like top down, you're looking at a fighter plane that's flying around. And they asked the developers like, okay, we really need for there to be clouds. Like we want you to be flying through the clouds in the game. And the developers started to think through, okay, well, how do I use the game engine to create clouds? And it turned out that they could create clouds, but the clouds had to be green because of some bizarre limitation of the engine. And the game designers were, very upset. They said, well, you can't have green clouds. Like clouds aren't green. What are we going to do? But then they decided, like, well, what if aliens attack the Earth and poison the sky, so now the clouds are green? And then, because the story is so malleable, they had the ability to sort of incorporate some of those technical restrictions into a world that still made sense. So because story and world building are sort of more constrained by imagination than they are by technology and design choice, being a little more flexible in that respect usually tends to pay off. So this ended up being a really useful tool to kind of prioritize work for TwilioQuest. And if you haven't checked it out before, it's within the game, it's sort of like a top-down RPG style game where you're navigating environments and you find like locked containers and barriers that can only be opened by completing programming challenges of various kinds. And that's really where what's most important about the game is introducing programming challenges. We want to teach people how to write JavaScript, install a JavaScript interpreter on their computer, create files on their file system, use the terminal to navigate their computer. And these are the things which are really important. So those practical skills that we're trying to impart on developers when they play the game. So when we looked at the design of the game in those early stages, we discovered pretty quickly that action is where this game was rooted. It was the things that you would do on your computer as a developer to pick up the practical skills of software development. And when we realized that, that helped us make some prioritization decisions that helped us get to where we are a little bit faster than we would have otherwise. So when you realize that the action is important, some other things become important too. Number one is the technical content, like the things that you encounter when you see a locked chest or a barrier or something along those lines. Creating that content, the educational content, and structuring the challenges in such a way where they presented an appropriate level of challenge based on what came before. Those ended up being the most important parts of the game to focus on. And because content was so important, authoring tools ended up being really important too. We needed to be able to let lots of different people contribute to the content. So, using Markdown and other human readable, input files ended up being really important. So we invested a lot of time in building tools that would allow, regular human beings to contribute content to TwilioQuest. We also allowed that to guide an important decision about the game, which is making it a PC game. So early on in the development of TwilioQuest, we were just under the assumption that this is going to be a web application. We're going to deliver it in the browser, and that's how this experience is going to work. But as we started thinking about like, all right, well, what kind of content do we want to create? What kind of action do we need to have in the game? We started thinking like, well, we want to be able to see if developers have installed Git so we can sort of validate that they've installed Git properly before we go on with the mission. Like maybe we'll want to have a database. We'll want them to install a database and have it running on a certain port on their computer. And as we sort of started to think through all the different kinds of content that we wanted to teach, then it really became obvious like this game has to be running on the PC. We can't teach developers how to use their computer like a developer unless we have access to their computer and we can see that they've installed PHP or that see that a local server is running on port 3000 and that sort of thing. So it actually also drove a very important platform decision by focusing on what was important from a design standpoint. Also, the narrative structure of the game ended up becoming really important. So this is one area where we actually did have to sort of branch out from the action to more of the story side of the game, because one of the important bits of power that we have by being a game versus just a tutorial website is we can actually use space as a teaching tool. So if we provide a hallway that branches in multiple directions, that sort of represents two different learning paths. So if you were to play through the JavaScript mission in TwilioQuest, there is a central chamber that you can go in different directions. And if you go south, you'll start to learn about Boolean logic. And if you go east, you learn about arrays. And if you go north, you learn about objects. So when you have sort of a fork in the road of the content that you want to teach, you can use 2D space to model that. And if there's a prerequisite of some kind, like you really can't go forward unless you have Node.js installed, you can make that a barrier and you have to actually clear that part of the game first before you can move into these other areas. So making a narrative out of the prerequisites and the branching choices that you have within a technical concept of some kind ends up being super important. And it's been really successful in the JavaScript mission, which is one of our most played bits of content in the game. And if people tend to get there, they tend to complete much more content in the game. So those bits ended up being super important. And we got there because we focused on what was most important, which was this technical content. What we discovered was less important were some things that made me pretty sad. Coming into this process, I have in my brain a very well-developed world of TwilioQuest that I really want to start injecting into the game experience. But all that exposition and world building may be fun for me as a novice fiction writer, but it's not as necessary to deliver the core experience of the game. I still hope to work some of those bits in there and try to here and there, but it ends up being less important in the game. One thing that also surprised us actually is as we were doing playtesting in this new version of TwilioQuest, the acquisition of experience points and loot, while still compelling, ended up being less of a driver for folks than some of the other things like making progress through the mission and getting to a certain percentage completion. So like seeing the narrative through to the end and checking off all of the different things that you could do within the game ended up being sort of more of an intrinsic reward, and these sort of extrinsic rewards of like, if you get to this place, you get a special hat for your avatar. Those things ended up being like still motivating, but less of a motivator than we would have thought. And also just some of the RPG staples like combat. Like I was pretty sure there was going to be like a Pokemon style combat system where you would encounter bad guys within the game and you'd have to fight them and on your way to these programming objectives. And while we still may do that, it turns out it just hasn't been necessary for people to get value out of the experience. Like creating a narrative structure, some environmental puzzles, those end up being pretty rewarding challenges in and of themselves. So when you start to kind of dig into these elements of your game's design, it forces you to think through like, well, what's really important? What should we be spending our development cycles on, which are ultimately pretty limited? And these are some of the trade-offs that we encountered when we were building TwilioQuest. So as you're kind of embarking on a game development project, it is worth kind of thinking through where your game is going to be anchored. Is it really about story? Is it about building a world that you can explore that's sort of rich and textured? Is it about like interesting economic decisions about like where to expend resources for maximum benefit? Is it about some kind of action? Like, is it really centered in what you do inside the game or what you do with other players? Or is it really just about escapism? Is it about putting your player in a perspective that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have? So thinking through which of these things is most important will help you make the most out of limited resources, which are your time and how much you can spend of it building out various aspects of the game. So that's a little bit about one of the like on the design side what I felt was helpful. But I also wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time talking through the TwilioQuest tech stack because as I understand it, most of the folks hanging out here today are web developers or getting into web development. So it might be interesting to learn how you can use those skills to build a PC game like TwilioQuest. And at the core of the experience is Electron, which is a desktop app framework that's used for the Slack desktop application for Visual Studio Code. It basically allows you to write HTML and CSS and JavaScript and package it up as a desktop application. And that ended up being a super important tool for us because we knew we wanted to present rich content like embedded videos and hyperlinks and images and all of that sort of thing. And those types of things the browser is really good at, but game engines like really suck at. So it became obvious really early that using web tech for a game like TwilioQuest made a lot of sense. The other major component, as you can see here, apparently there's not very much creativity with open source project logo design, but is React. So we use the React front end tools to create most of the user interface for the application. So that kind of sits on top of a more gamey bit, which is driven by Phaser. Phaser is like a 2D game framework for the browser, and it uses the WebGL canvas to render the in-game content, so like characters and all the stuff that you can crash into and all the maps that you can explore. We use Phaser as the framework for that. And then on top of that WebGL canvas, we have this React-based UI where most of the heavy lifting of the application is done, where we have settings shown and where you bring up like the hack interface, as we call it in TwilioQuest. That's a React component that's that's showing you the content and allowing you to attempt to hack those barriers that you see in the game. So these technologies have ended up working together really nicely. And if you've ever done any development, like trying to use like a Unity or a Game Maker Studio or any of these other tools, you know that like creating user interface is actually super hard. Like having text arranged in a certain way or having buttons that respond to user input. Game engines just aren't really built to write software in that way. So in this tech stack, we actually get to have the best of both worlds, where we get to create user interface using HTML and CSS and JavaScript, using something awesome like React. And then behind that, we get to use this game engine, Phaser, which is really good at physics and collisions and rendering stuff to a WebGL canvas. So we kind of get to have our cake and eat it too by using these two technologies together. So with this particular tech stack, there are some trade-offs, as there always are. We talked a little bit about user interface being way easier in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's definitely true. One really nice thing as a web developer, if you're targeting Electron, if Electron is the runtime for your application, you're always in a Chrome browser. So you can be assured that APIs like WebRTC, WebSockets, all of the sort of bleeding edge web tech features of the browser are going to run consistently across platforms because there's no cross-browser compatibility issues anymore, because it's always going to be a Chromium browser underneath. Choosing web tech also makes it much easier for many more types of developers to contribute. It's relatively difficult to find developers with extensive experience in Unity or Unreal or something like that. But most developers that you encounter at least know enough HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to be dangerous. And there's a rich and growing ecosystem of really great front end developers that you can find as well. So that ends up being a less tangible bonus as well. For a game like TwilioQuest, where we're actually doing a lot of like integrations with third-party services, and we're doing validations to see like, oh, did you actually send an email a SegGrid? Let's make an API request to make sure that you did. Having access to the entire Node.js and web tech ecosystem within the game allows us to build those types of features much faster. So the Node ecosystem, the web tech ecosystem, and open source in general is helping us much more than it would perhaps in another engine. There are, of course, some drawbacks. So the performance of the game is not nearly as great as we would like it to be on lower end hardware, owing to Phaser and WebGL generally just not being able to produce the same type of performance without significant optimization that you can get through a native game engine. So that's just kind of a hit that we are taking that we're kind of just have decided to be okay with. But it's certainly a con to consider. There's also just generally a lack of good high-level tooling in web game development. So we use, for map editing, we use an open source tool called Tiled to create the environments that you explore in the game. And then that tool outputs a JSON file, which we then read into the game to render all of those maps in the game itself. And that's okay, but it's not as robust as like something that you'd have in Unity or GameMaker or any of these other tools where all of your like game objects and scripting and even your art development sometimes can all live within this big monolithic IDE tool, which can be really nice. So the tooling is a lot more primitive than what you would get in like a proper game engine. And probably the worst part of this entire project is going from the browser to desktop. You have to deal with like packaging and distribution. So the corporate overlords, which rule Mac OS and Windows as platforms, punish you extremely heavily for kind of trying to go outside their ecosystem of app stores and things. So the code signing, all the hoops that you have to jump through to create the packages that you put on these different platforms is a tremendous tax on your time and sanity. So that is a definite con, but more a con of like going from the browser to the desktop. So if you do embark on this journey, and I do recommend that you try it out. It's been the most fun I've ever had creating software in my entire career. Making games is much harder than making websites, at least in my opinion, but it's also been just a blast to work on. So I do recommend that you try it. But when you do, a couple things to keep in mind. So Electron has a number of packagers in userland, which sort of help you bootstrap a project and then package it up for different platforms. And those are kind of great if you can stay on the happy path. But if you need to kind of veer off the happy path, which is documented in the README of those tools, things tend to go off the rails pretty quickly in my experience. So in the TwilioQuest project, we use Electron Packager, which is a much lower level API for creating distributable like EXEs and apps for different platforms. And I would highly recommend kind of building your own tool chain with NPM scripts using Electron Packager, use it versus using some of these higher level tools. You'll have more control over how you build your web assets and how you handle other aspects of your project. Whereas, some of the higher level tools are a little more heavy handed and make you structure your JavaScript in a certain way or assume that you're going to use TypeScript or something along those lines. There's also differences to consider when you're testing your game like over HTTP versus when your game is being loaded from files on the file system, as it typically is in like a production packaged Electron application. So the browser, when it loads assets via HTTP, has a similar path, but not completely similar to like how it works with accessing files from the file system. So constantly testing like how your assets are loading from a development server, which is beneficial. Oftentimes you'll want to develop your game when it's being served from like a local web server. So you could take advantage of things like hot module reloading and some of the other tool like developer tools that you can get from loading your code into even loading it into Electron from the server. But you do want to frequently test what that behavior is going to be when you package up the app for distribution and are loading those same assets from the file system rather than through an HTTP request. So definitely something to keep in mind. The patterns of file system access are also different across platforms. There are protected directories that exist, but you can't access across different operating systems unless you have the right permissions. There's also newer restrictions on Mac OS, where your app has to request permission to access the file system in certain ways. So if your application does use file system access, as ours does rather extensively, those are definitely some things that are going to shoot you or come back to bite you at various points. And I also indicated before, but the worst part about developing for the desktop is the code signing process that the major desktop OS vendors make you go through in order to sign your packages and distribute them to your users. So TwilioQuest we provide as a direct download, but on Windows, for example, the reason that when you launch the TwilioQuest installer on Windows and you don't get a scary error message is because we have gone through the process of getting an extended validation code signing certificate from Microsoft, for which we had to pay thousands of dollars and spend months working through various layers of bureaucracy to get our organization approved to have one. Also that when an end user downloads our package, they don't see a scary error message that says, this is a virus, please delete it. The reason that our installer works without that error message is because we went through all of this rigmarole. So while it definitely is possible, my advice to you as someone who cares for your well-being and sanity is, in this case, unless it's essential, just bow to your corporate overlords in this instance and distribute the software through app stores, whether it's Steam or the App Store on Mac or what have you. Doing the manual code signing has been just a beast, and I do not recommend it to anyone who likes themselves and doesn't want to cry into their keyboard late at night, as I once did. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and I'm going to head back out to Zoom for Q&A. But once again, I definitely recommend that if you have thought about getting into game development, just do it. Create something small and put it out there. Just get it in the hands of other people, see what works and what doesn't work, and think about one of those aspects of the design stack and like what is one element that you could really nail, like you could really do well. If it's, it could be as simple as like a doodle jump where it's like, I'm going to make this game really good at jumping. That's really all you need. And with the tools of web development, you actually can create those games, you can distribute those games, and you can make real experiences for that will make lots of people happy. And I really hope that you do give it a try. So with that, I'm going to hop over to Zoom and answer any questions that you might have. So let's take a look. Can you talk about what it was like making the switch from web development to game development? And looking back, would it be better to study web or game development with the chance that you might switch later? So I don't know if it's better to start in one direction or the other, but there are like different patterns of game versus web development. So like the game render loop is a concept that game developers who have more experience in that on that side of software development kind of fundamentally understand the same way that I, as a web developer, understand like the HTTP request and response cycle. Like it's just something that is part of everything that we do as web developers that you don't have to necessarily consider unless you're a game developer. So there's definitely those types of things that you'll have to learn as foundational concepts. I think one thing that's been valuable, I can't sort of speak to like what game development could teach me about web development too much. I guess there is maybe one thing, but one thing that's been great about moving from the web to game development is in the web development world, we value open source a lot. Like we sort of default to using open source tools, contributing to open source. and like working out in the open with tools that other people can benefit from. And having like the Node.js ecosystem, the web tech ecosystem to draw from to create the application parts of the game has been immensely valuable. And if you kind of started from a world where you weren't sort of ensconced in that, that's definitely a disadvantage. One thing about game design and development that has really informed my work on the web too is one thing I really respect about how game developers go about their work is that they're laser focused on the experience that they are delivering to users. Like, you know, concerns that are inward facing, like we're going to have perfect abstractions in our code. We're going to have like the coolest Jenkins deploy pipeline in the entire universe. Like those types of things that don't matter to users don't matter as much to game developers as they tend to matter to us as web developers. And I think that more of that focus on what the user experience is could benefit us in web development quite a bit as well. Yes, other questions. How many similarities are there between web and game development behind the scenes? So there are some. I kind of spoke about it a little bit, but the feedback loop is actually pretty similar. Like if you're a web developer and you're used to pushing pixels and testing CSS changes, like having those fast feedback cycles ends up being super important in game development as well. So like that loop feels pretty similar. And given that we're writing the game in JavaScript, all of the tips and tricks that from JavaScript will still apply. So the code patterns that you learn, like any JavaScript tooling or language features that you invested in are definitely going to be useful in game development, and at least in this stack as well. So I'm new to game development. I have some experience in web dev, but I don't know how relevant is that. I'm wondering if there's a type of game that is recommended to start with for learning, or whether anything is possible as long as you have motivation. The latter is definitely true. Anything is possible if you have the motivation. The more successful developers in general, like web and game developers, tend to focus on shipping something, even if it's something small. So I think there's not any particular type of game, which I think is the best one to focus on for a beginner, except for something that's small. So like Doodle Jump is one of my favorite examples to go to. That's really just about jumping. Like there's one button, that's all you do. Or like Cannibal, like an endless runner. Like a lot of the really cool like indie game projects that I've seen have come from like coming up with a mechanic, like really just one kernel of something fun, and then just like building an experience around it. So I think my best advice would be to just try to find like the smallest nugget of thing that you could build, and then focus on shipping it, because where you learn the most, where I've learned the most at least, is not from building it so as much as like, all right, well now it works, but how do I get it in front of users? How do I learn that it's working? Like what do I need to ask when I'm interviewing someone that's playing the game? Like there's so much that you learn from shipping the software and finishing and getting it out in the world than you wouldn't learn if you were kind of always tinkering. So finding something small and getting it out there and shipping it would probably be my best advice there. What would you use as a backend to build a multiplayer game with multiple users? Yeah, that's a good question. There's actually a decent amount of like cloud platforms out there now which do multiplayer game services. So in general, I'm more inclined to try to like buy versus build that type of technology, because a lot of like the work of game development is in figuring out if an experience is fun. So like I'd much rather use like a lumberyard or a cloud-based service of some kind to manage those things if I could get away with it. That being said, because you're using the web technology stack, you have access to like really great technology like Socket.io and WebSockets and WebRTC generally. So you can, I've seen really cool projects that use just only peer-to-peer communication via WebRTC like data channels. and there's a host. So you could build like something on the scale of Among Us, say, with 5, 10 players just using WebRTC, like peer-to-peer technology. So like that's maybe where I'd start with like, I mean, if I figured I could get away with it, I would try to do instanced multiplayer environments using like WebRTC tech versus trying to do some big MMO servery thing. So I mean, that's probably where I would start. But if I did need that like big MMO server type technology, I would probably look to buy versus build. And there are a few vendors out there that do that now. Can I explain what I mean by shipping it? Is it similar to adding final touches? Yeah, I think I mean like kind of making it into a product like that is on a website that somebody can log into and download, provide you some feedback on. So like rather than having like a build that isn't signed that people download off the GitHub repository, which is all great, by the way. Like if that's the point that you get to and that's how you distribute your game, that's totally fine. But those layers of polish, making it possible for people to pay you for the game, or making it possible for people to, submit support requests, and like getting to the point where, there's, maybe a marketing web page for it. So like those types of things have, at least in my experience, been super educational as far as like understanding what it takes to make it into a product versus, a piece of software that a sufficiently motivated person could download and use. Is it true that pursuing a safe career in game development, working at a reasonably sized company, comes at the cost of little to no creative input? I would love to do game dev and have near complete creative control, but I feel like without following some sort, it would be hard to sustain. And I mean, I do think that that's generally going to be true. Like if you work for EA and you're one of 500 people working on a project, it's going to take you a while to get that creative input. And that's why a lot of like industry veterans will often like break off and create these smaller indie development shops so that they have that creative input. So if you're like from my perspective as like somebody who has worked in web development, has worked in like high tech or with technology companies for most of your career, a lot of the experimentation and the freedom that I've had over those years has been in like side projects and things that I've been able to work on in my free time. So I think that is just a trade-off. Like, I've got 3 kids and a mortgage, which constrain the amount of risk that I can take on, right? And I think that is true for a lot of different folks. But yeah, I mean, I think your read on the situation is right. But like, paying your dues and like woodshedding and learning the tools of the trade are what's going to give you that power and flexibility and ability later on to, take some of those risks and do some of those projects yourself. Yeah, a good question about where does the average person go to get eyes on their starting projects? So itch.io is great. The Ryan Kubik, who I work with on the TwilioQuest project, has published games on itch, and it's a great way to get feedback. One of the best ways to get feedback, and this is what we did in the very early days of TwilioQuest, is just taking your game to like meetups of various kinds. Like maybe there's a game developer meetup, there is in most towns, that you can go try out and go get some feedback from folks like that. Or just other organizations that might be sort of incidentally interested in the project. Like I've taken TwilioQuest to hackathons, to MBA meetings, because I'm interested in like what non-technical people think about playing the game. So meetups are like, that was the well that I kept going back to find folks for user testing. And even in a virtual world, that's going to be a little harder. But itch is a great platform to get it out there, but also just taking part in events and participating in communities has been the most fruitful thing for me anyway. What do I think about an AI RPG game which changes the story according to the actions of the player? I think it's great. I don't know if I'm smart enough to build it, but I think it would be awesome. And I suspect, like, maybe in like 40 years time, that will be the state of the art. So I think it's a great idea, and you should build that and let me be an early investor in that project. Thoughts on using 3JS for building a 3D game? That's a good question. I'm trying to think if I've seen any web game stuff built on top of 3JS. It's definitely possible. I know like a lot of the similar drawing libraries are used under the covers for a lot of the other 2D game engines that are out there for the browser. An earlier version of Phaser was built on top of Pixie.js, which was essentially a library for like writing to a WebGL canvas. So I suspect 3JS would be a good choice for that layer of like a rendering engine, but I'm not immediately familiar with projects that have used it for that. But it's certainly possible, I would think. But I would imagine that those rendering those APIs would be a little lower level, and you'd be writing like game engine code at that point versus game code a lot of the time. Have I ever used Unreal Engine? Only a tiny bit. So we actually evaluated a lot of game engines, like at the outset of the TwilioQuest project, and the Unreal Engine was one of them. But again, it was like it would have meant an investment in a technology that I was not super familiar with. But it seemed pretty cool. If I was better at C++, I probably would have had a better time with it. But I don't have extensive experience with it, no. We have someone who's really interested in animation and CGI. How similar are technologies that are used for them? That's kind of going to be like a different tool chain. So like the TwilioQuest was kind of always envisioned as like sort of an homage to like the RPGs of the 16-bit era. So like 2D sprites rendered in pixel art was kind of the only place where we started with that. But yeah, I mean, that's one thing that like, bigger game engines have to offer is like a workflow that ingests 3D models from other tools into the work that you're doing. But yeah, it's that is unfortunately like a little outside my personal area of expertise. The extent of the art that I'm able to produce is pixel art, kind of like the crappy stuff that the nice stuff that you'll find is actually built by Carrie Lake, who's a pixel artist that works on the project. The crappier stuff is made by me, and that is the extent of my art abilities. And a question about code.org. What do I think of it? Can I get one that's better or more realistic? I actually think code.org is great for introducing like principles of software development. But one of the reasons why TwilioQuest is the way that it is, like the content of TwilioQuest is designed the way it is I think what those tools don't do a great job of is like teaching you how to be a software developer. Like they teach you about code, but not necessarily about like the processes and the muscle memory of actually writing code on your computer as a developer. So in TwilioQuest, we want you to actually install Node.js. We want you to create a file on your computer that you will edit with a text editor, because we think that those like workflows are important. Like those are the things that we do every day as software developers. We don't sort of use necessarily a browser-based tool all the time to do our work. So I think code.org is great. And like Codecademy, like the stuff that you can do in the browser is amazing at teaching syntax, and that's great. But I do think like it needs to be supplemented by doing the things that you will do as a developer. So I think like playing through TwilioQuest, if you've done code.org or some of those browser-based tools before, TwilioQuest will be a nice sort of break from that, in the sense that like you will be doing stuff on your computer. You'll be installing Python, you'll be executing Python code, and that'll help you sort of make real some of those more abstract skills that you might have already started building, which are also super valuable. Have maybe one more question here before we gotta cede the floor. So would Firebase be a good backend for an instance multiplayer game? I think it would. I'm a big fan. So a lot of TwilioQuest backend server code is actually powered by Firebase. We don't have a lot of like, we don't have multiplayer features besides like kind of the events that people can do and like participate in and play TwilioQuest together. But I think it could be a good choice for real-time games as well. The thing that could become challenging is just the bill that you might eventually rack up, depending on how many interactions you have on the server. Like if it was more of like a turn-based game, like if you were going to make like Hearthstone or Magic the Gathering Arena, the synchronization, like there wouldn't be as much chattiness with the UI as it would be like for like a multiplayer RTS game or something like that. So I think your Firebase build would get pretty big pretty fast for a more real-time game, but for like a turn-based game, I think it could be great. And in general, I definitely recommend Firebase as like a low maintenance backend when most of your important work is happening on the client, as it is for TwilioQuest. All right, so yeah, I'll go ahead and export the slides to a PDF and I'll tweet them out. I'm just at Kevin Winnery on Twitter. So if you are interested in the slides, happy to share them out that way. Yeah, I really appreciate everyone hanging out today. And I am super excited to see so many questions and people excited about getting into making games. I really hope you do. It's super fun. I waited much too long to get into it. It's been super fun for me. So thank you very much for hanging out for the session today.